China, dear General Consul of People's Republic of China in São Paulo State, Chen Peijie, dear Professor Chen Yi from Fudan University, Chen Yi from Peking University, and Shu Yanran from Renmin University of China. And dear Brazilian professors, Marcos Cordeiro from São Paulo State University, Daniele Ramos from University of Brasilia, and my colleague from Unicamp, Professor Bruno de Conti, on behalf of Unicamp, the Institute of Economics and the Brazil-China Study Group, I would like to welcome everyone. I also would like to welcome all the participants who are following this webinar through your YouTube channel. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the webinar Multilateralism after COVID-19, importance of upholding multilateralism and the role of China and Brazil. With aims to discuss this very important topic and at the same time reinforce the links between important universities in Brazil and China. Recently, the world has been experiencing several turbulences that defies the multilateral system of international relations built after the Second World War. On one hand, we have seen the increasing use of unilateral strategies that challenge the principle of building a cooperative world order. This is an increasingly present threat, and it's becoming more serious at a time when the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that certain global problems do not concern just one nation, but depends on the collaborative efforts of all nations from the world. The same can be said about other problems and challenges, like, for instance, that posed by global warming, increasing inequalities, and financial turmoil. The construction of cooperative solution is increasingly necessary. On the other hand, from the point of view of the Global South, the previous multilateral system, especially in its economic dimension, have been showing important weakness. It is imposed difficulties to increasing the representation of developing countries. Countries that constitute the large part of population in the world, and which has also represented a growing share of the global economy. In this context, discussion about the future of multilateral relation, analyzing the perspective of Brazil and China on this issue is very, very important. I therefore reinforce my satisfaction in organizing this webinar together with the Consulate of China and with the representatives of prestigious universities from Brazil and China. Finally, I would like to point out that Unicamp, through its international office, through the Brazil-China Study Group, the partnership between Unicamp and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences through the CAS Unicamp Center, and through all of its faculties and institutes, is ready for new initiatives like this one to further strengthen cooperative ties between Brazil and China. Now I would like to give the floor to the General Consul of China in São Paulo, Chen Peijie, to say her opening words. Please.
Okay, thank you. Well, I will take off my mask to say hello to everyone. Hello, all distinguished professors, all dear friends, good morning and welcome to this seminar. I'd like to introduce two more of my colleagues to also join us. This one is my Deputy Consul General, Mr. Tianyu Zhen, and this is Consul, Mr. Zhang Zhu. So I take it on. Welcome to this seminar, and also I thank you, University of Convenience University, to work together with us to organize this seminar, and all professors who work hard for this. So thank you very much. And this year marks the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. Tomorrow is the United Nations Day. a day to commemorate the entry into force of the UN Charter and the official founding of the UN. On this occasion, I'm honored to have the opportunity to join you in sharing with each other views by focusing on multilateralism and looking beyond the pandemic. Currently, the world is in the situation of profound changes and a serious pandemic unseen in a century, and facing a new round of major development, major changes, and major adjustments. At this moment, it is of great significance to discuss the revitalization of multilateralism. Recently, at a series of UN summits and high-level meetings on the 75th anniversary, Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered important speeches, reiterating to firmly uphold the UN-centered international system, firmly uphold the international order underpinned by international law, firmly defend the UN-centered role in international affairs. President Xi also proposed China's position and a plan aiming at responding to the common challenges. It is just like to inject a bolster into multilateralism, bring confidence and hope to this uncertainty world. Why should we stick to multilateralism? Mankind has entered a new era of interconnectedness, with countries sharing intertwined interests and their future closely linked together. Facing common challenges, no country can stand on its own. The COVID-19 has taught us again that the world needs global action more than ever before. Multilateralism is more urgent and important than ever before. Unilateral bullying and beggarly neighbor practices have no way out. President Xi pointed out that global threats and global challenges require strong and global responses. The UN 75-year history has also proven that the spirit of equal consultation, openness, and inclusiveness, and win-win cooperation embodied in multilateralism is increasingly becoming the consensus of the international community, as well as the important and the best path for world peace and development, for protecting interests and solving problems. How to improve the multilateral mechanism? Regarding UN, which is the most universal, representative, and authoritative international cooperation platform, in addition to the three firm upholding mentioned earlier, President Xi also emphasized that in the post-COVID era, the UN must stand for justice, uphold the rule of law, promote cooperation, and focus on real action. There must be no practice of exceptionalism or double standards. The UN would be more balanced in reflecting the interests and the wishes of the majority of countries in the world, especially developing countries. As the founding member of the UN and the only developing country among the permanent members of the Security Council of the UN, China has contributed a lot in this regard. In addition, other multilateral cooperation platforms can be good supplementary to the development of multilateral mechanism, such as the BRICS that we are all familiar with. The BRICS spirit and the cooperation outcomes have given it global significant influence. How to safeguard multilateralism? We need to advocate consultation, cooperation, and share the benefits in global governance. Only through consultation and cooperation can countries achieve mutual benefit, win-win cooperation, and common development, and tackle global challenges more effectively. President Xi pointed out that it is natural for countries to have differences. What's important is to address them through dialogue and consultation. countries may engage in competition, but such competition should be positive and healthy in nature. When in competition, countries should not breach the moral standard and they should comply with international norms. We should pursue win-win cooperation and rise above ideological disputes, aiming at achieving a green recovery of the world economy in the post-COVID era. All countries should pursue innovative, coordinated, green and open development for all, and deepen cooperation between countries in various fields. This also includes upholding the principles of free trade and market competition and enable an open, fair, just, and non-discriminatory business environment. For example, instead of politicizing the issue, governments should treat all 5G companies in a non-discriminatory manner so that 5G could be used and benefit mankind. This is exactly what China practices. In fighting COVID-19, China upholds the concept of a community of health for all, actively participates in international cooperation, provides support to global humanitarian response plan for COVID-19 of the UN, implements effectively commitments of international aid, solemnly pledges to make a vaccine developed and deployed by China a global public good, which will be provided to developing countries as a priority. This month, China joined the COVAX also. In the field of development, China earnestly implements the Paris Agreement on climate change and strives to achieve the best goals, maintains the multilateral trading system based on the WTO, adheres to the expansion of open and cooperation, refrain from zero-sum game, actively contribute to international public products, share the development dividend with the international community through the Belt and Road Initiative, and inject a new impetus to the development of multilateralism. No matter how the international situation may change, peace and development remain the theme of our times. The rise of emerging markets and developing countries remains unchanged. The trend toward a multipolar world remains unchanged. The continuous economic globalization, despite the twists and turns, remains unchanged. We must firmly hold high the banner of the multilateralism to make it better reflect the changing international landscape and the aspirations and interests of the majority of countries, especially emerging markets and developing countries. In this regard, both China and Brazil can accomplish great things. We both are large developing countries and emerging economies, and also forces that cannot be ignored in the process of multipolarization. We have a great common understanding and jointly contributed in safeguarding multilateralism and promoting international cooperation. The bilateral cooperation between us also has yielded fruitful results. For example, while the pandemic negatively impacted all around the world, Brazil's export to China has grown against a negative backdrop. We also have had good cooperation on the combat against the pandemic, demonstrating the huge potentials of our cooperation in various fields. In the post-pandemic era, China and Brazil need continue to develop the bilateral relations as good friends and partners. Meanwhile, we need continue to strengthen coordination in revitalizing multilateralism and safeguarding the free trade system. to promote the better development of multilateral mechanisms like UN, BRICS, WTO, etc., to safeguard the common interests of developing countries. Work together to address global challenges in the world, to be the firm force for maintaining world peace and development. Oh, dear friends, I would like to conclude it by quoting the words of President Xi Jinping. The world now stands at a new historical starting point. Let's renew our firm commitment to multilateralism and work to promote a community with a shared future for mankind. Thank you for your attention. And now I'm looking forward to your valuable inputs and insights. Thank you.
Okay, this is Chen Peijie. Thank you for these very important words. Then we can start the session of speech from our professors. I would like to give the floor to Professor Chen Peijie, professor at the School of International Relations and Public Affairs from Fudan University, and also director of Center for BRICS Studies. Professor Chen Peijie, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, General Consulate from China side, distinguished guest. It's my great honor to be invited to participate in these fantastic sessions to talking about the importance of this multilateralism, the cooperation among China and Brazil, the cooperation among BRICS countries, especially in these times where the world suffering from this COVID-19, and we all need to fighting against this pandemic. I think it's very interesting. Because of the withdrawal of the United States and other Western countries from the leading position of the first wave of globalizations since the end of the Cold War, now few people mention the terms like complex interdependence, globalizations, and so on. More and more people, especially the Western scholars, become quite pessimistic about the future of the world. But you will find it's very interesting. On the contrary, especially when we're suffering this COVID-19 pandemic, you'll find it's the time that we need all these things than ever before. We need a real complex interdependence. Actually, we live in such kind of world, you cannot cut off it. You'll find that we need a real cross-border cooperations to fighting against this virus. We need multilateralism-based cooperations, joint research to develop the vaccines. That it may be the only hope we can completely, finally defeat the virus. I think it's a great challenges, but also a great opportunities, a very strategic opportunities for BRICS countries. If we have those memories, we will remember why we have these BRICS. When Goldman Sachs initiated these terms, they never think that the BRICS will become a kind of de facto existing international institutions. They just use a kind of financial labs, but the BRICS continues even after they refuse to use these terms anymore. Why? Because all these BRICS countries, they represent all the actors inside these systems that really need the multilateralisms. Just like Ms. General Consulate already mentioned, that such kind of multilateralism should be based on several principles. For example, the most important, we need to respect each other's core interest, representing by respected equity of the sovereignty toward each other. While at the same time, we need to become very tolerant, to tolerate the difference among each others. We come from different countries. We have different historical and cultural background, but we join together with the driven of these globalization procedures. We need to cooperate to fighting against the potential risk and the challenges produced by the globalizations, while at the same time, we need to become more effectively produce a framework that governs all these changes producing by the procedures of globalizations. I'm a quite young scholar doing research on international relations in China. Either the BRICS countries or Sino-Brazil bilateral relationship is quite a new area to me. But according to my very limited personal experience, I found out that both countries, both of us, shared great major interest to push forward the future development of multilateralism in this new environment. Just like we already mentioned, either in the healthcare to countering this COVID-19 pandemic, or that we launch a more effective governance corporations to launch the new norms to govern the global cyberspace in the framework of UN OEWG platforms, or the China and the Brazil companies try to finding out more business space that will benefit for both in these globalization procedures and in the framework to enhance the practical cooperations among BRICS countries. All this experience providing very vivid, consolidated basement for the future cooperations. And here, I want to take advantage of these opportunities to raise three initiations or suggestions for future cooperations between our two countries and among the inside the frameworks of the BRICS. The first, I think, the research institutions, especially the university-based research institutions, need to have more concrete bilateral or multilateral cooperation mechanisms to push forward the joint research, focusing on Sino-Brazil cooperations and the Sino, especially under the framework of the BRICS countries. Fudan universities, our centers, serve as the secretary of the BRICS University League. In future days, I wish that we have more opportunities to push forward more concrete cooperations in that framework by developing joint research programs, exchanges senior grade students, and to push forward the professor exchanges, of course, after we defeated this COVID-19 and eliminate the threat that will terminate these real cross-border travels. And the second, I think we need to pick up several advanced or emerging fields representing by the governance of global cyberspace to launch our joint research. Such kind of joint research should become a final production of kind of policy initiations among our two countries, representing by, for example, it's highly probable that China and Brazil to launch kind of draft norms to governing the cross-border data flows, which is very important to doing business, launch cross-border communications like this online conference between our two countries in today's world. But I think we still now don't have quite enough effective cooperation on these things. And we can also both contribute to push forward the cooperation on this side. And the third, just like the General Counsel already mentioned, I think President Xi Jinping makes his very clear attitude in his address in this UN anniversary conference that China will embrace the multilateralism. Okay, 5 minutes. I only needed 2 or 3 minutes at most. And President Xi Jinping already made his point very clear that China will embrace and leading the future development of this multilateralism globally. And China and Brazil de facto can launch kind of roadmap initiations inside the BRICS countries that to make a very clear announcement, all the BRICS countries will become the leading powers in this post-pandemic world that push forward a positive reform of global governance structures based on this positive liberal multilateralisms, based on the respect to the core interest of all the participants, which is, I think, can become very important contribution for today's world. Okay, that's my point. Wish that will be thankful. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chen Yi. I would like now to give the floor to Professor Marcos Cordeiro Pires, Professor of International Relations at São Paulo State University, and also a close friend from Unicamp also. Thank you, Professor Marcos, for accepting this invitation.
Thank you, Professor Hiratuka. Firstly, bom dia, good morning, 早上好. But for our friends to China, good evening. I would like to congratulate the Consul, Mrs. Chen Peijie, Professor Célio Hiratuka for conducting this event, my colleagues from Brazil and China, and all attendants of this meeting. It's an honor to participate of these seminars that seeks to think on the deepening of multilateralism to face the several challenges that will arise after the pandemic of COVID-19. Before this event, I spoke with Professors Daniela Ramos and Bruno de Conti to prepare or coordinate our intervention. It was up to me to describe the current guidelines of Brazilian diplomacy, the part one, more critical issue, I think. Professor Daniela will describe the ongoing actions mainly related to Brazil-China cooperation. And Professor Bruno will highlight an agenda for deepening cooperation at the multilateral level. First, it's important to pay attention to the radical change in Brazilian foreign policy that occurred since the inauguration of President Jair Bolsonaro in January 2019. Because a radical change. Since 1974, in almost a linear manner, Brazil diplomacy pursued to strengthen multilateral institutions. At the same time, it sought great autonomy and protagonism for Brazil. The country participates at almost 78 international organizations or missions and has played an active role in advocating human rights, the interest of developing countries, fair trade, a sustainable environment, and a Latin American integration. Therefore, in this period, the country never had an unconditional alignment vis-a-vis the great powers. But from 2019, the autonomous attitude gave way to an unconditional alignment with the US policy, particularly in regard to the emptying the multilateral institution. Since then, Brazilian diplomacy aligned itself with the United States in defense of an unfair peace treaty for the Israel-Palestine conflict, adopted a dubious policy regarding the climate change negotiation at the Madrid summit, threatening the Venezuelan government with a military intervention, destroyed the UNASUR, abandoned CELAC, supported the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, supported political destabilization in Bolivia, intervened in Argentine electoral process, and more recently, joined with the United States and Japan in WTO to harass China on the issues of market economy. From the perspective of bilateral relationship with China, despite the pragmatic efforts of sectors in the government more linked with the business community, had occurred a lot of crises, such as those related to the criticism of the president's son, the former Minister of Education attacks, and more recently, even this week, relating to the theme of the coronavirus vaccine. Specifically about Chancellor Ernesto Araújo, he has been guided by an ideological discourse associated with the US far-right groups in a critique of the so-called globalism and cultural Marxism that would have appropriated of multilateral institution. In an article issued in last April entitled "Coronavirus has arrived," seeks indirectly to attack China and states that globalism is the new path to communism. The virus appears, in fact, as an immense opportunity to accelerate the globalist project. This week, I selected 3 statements made by Brazilian authorities that are very serious because they represent. The first one from the President Jair Bolsonaro. Brazil is not a partner of the US. Brazil is an ally. From the Minister of Economy, Paulo Guedes. This approach has a sense of geopolitics. We trade with the whole world, but we know who are our geopolitical partners. During the meeting, when Brazil and US signed a lot of agreements. And the statement made by Minister Araújo. Brazil is willing to be an international pariah if it is to defend freedom. It's very interesting to pay attention for our strategic. But I conclude my speech by drawing attention to the limits of the Brazilian foreign affairs under the Bolsonaro government. Nowadays, our diplomacy is an extension of the Department of State, and these guidelines face a new Donald Trump term will be deepened. However, the pressures of the Brazilian civil society and a change in the guidance of international politics, such as Biden's victory, could curb these trends. It's important to pay attention how the Brazilian government lead with the thematic of Internet 5G. They send a lot of signals that Brazilian government will be blocked. But it's important to see that a lot of business leaders, the mainly newspapers, the most part of the media sought for a fair bid for the Internet 5G, because everybody knows that for Brazil, the better option is the best quality, the best price, the best confiability. Then I conclude one more time to congratulate Mrs. Chen Peijie and Professor Célio Hiratuka and other friends in this meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Marcos, for this very clear speech, but also very worrisome speech. Then I'd like to turn to Professor Xu Yanran, Professor of School of International Studies at Renmin University of China. Please, Professor Chu.
Hi, okay. You can call me Sharon.
Okay,
I'm going to share
Sharon.
my screen. Yeah,
Mhm.
I made a PowerPoint. Hold on.
Perfect.
Okay, so this is my PowerPoint. Can you guys see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just know this topic is about multilateralism, but since like my interest is in Sino-Brazilian relations, so I talk more on each side. So today my topic is roles of China and Brazil in a multilateral world. So what is the current global chant toward multilateralism? I think first is that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, is a catalyst for US-China standoff, which is a full-blown confrontation in 2020. And there are several countries, including Brazil, prefer some unilateral steps, focusing self-interest in politics, like this previous professor said, instead of mutual interests. And we also see a great demand for state sovereignty and independence. And the current relationship between China and Brazil is that since the pandemic began, there were some cabinet members in Brazil trying to put all the blame of the governmental weaknesses, like shortage of medical resources, ignorance of the severity of the virus, and domestic wealth gap, etc., and try to put all this blame on China. So China was set as a scapegoat. But on the other hand, a host of agricultural interest groups, including the Minister of Agriculture, Teresa, has put pressures on President Bolsonaro to relieve the intensity of the verbal battle between Chinese and Brazilian politicians. So I think the overall attitude toward China from Brazilian government is now relatively moderate, except we have this the day before yesterday, October 22nd, is that the President Bolsonaro said we have no intention of buying Chinese-made vaccines, right? So, but I think the current, relations between China and Brazil, relatively moderate, relatively. So if we look at the Brazilian imports in the first half of 2020, we see that China still, it's largest trading partner. Right, so like China has its, Brazilian has its imports from China around $16.7 billion, while it has its imports from the United States of 13.118 billions. And if you look at the Brazilian leading exporting goods to China, the soybeans is still taking a large amount of the exporting goods to China. Right, still taking that and following with oil and iron ore. So the large amount of commodities are still the main engine for Brazil and China's relationship. So the realities between these two countries nowadays are basically, number one is that I think the pandemic exacerbates the increased independence of Brazilian economic recovery on China. So that's number one reality. We have to face it. Is that because in this first half of 2020, China has gobbled up 33.7% of Brazilian exports. And in light of this US-China trade war, China has shifted its imports from the US to Brazil in products like soybeans and meat, right, including beef and chickens, right? And so like what I just said, in the short and medium term, agricultural production will still be the main engine. But the COVID-19 pandemic has also hit some Brazil sectors harder than others industry. Right, so the domestic Brazilian economic problems, I think this is very chronic. And also it's the problem within this relationship between China and Brazil is that it still has this competing atmosphere in manufacturing goods markets. One of the reasons is because the Brazil still has cannot reduce its costs in making the manufacturing goods. And the other one is that we still see in this resilience of commodities, right? The strong momentum of the commodities, trading between these two countries. So I think Bolsonaro's stance of foreign policy and his stance on multilateralism has several factors. One is that it definitely takes a pro-US stance, and this has no doubt, and it has an increase in bilateral relations between the US and Brazil. Right, so number one is that it has become, and it's more and more become a pivot country for the US in the region, right? Because we see that Bolsonaro has a very strong in-group bias, what we just call the ideological identity, right? In-group bias by using we, allies, us, democracy versus calling those countries like Venezuela, Cuba as enemies or non-democratic. Right, so it's very in-group bias. And also on March 2019, right, we have the Brazil as the founder, one of the founders of the Prosur, right, aims at placing UNASUR, but also excluding Venezuela and Bolivia in that organization, right? And on January 2020, it also saying it step out from CELAC because the CELAC has not making a more democratic forms in those countries like Venezuela, right? So number two is that Bolsonaro stand firmly with the US in regards to international affairs. One, like supporting US sanctions against Iran and creating UN Migration Pact, and also considering leaving WHO after Donald Trump said he would like to leave WHO. So the future aspects or prospects of Bolsonaro's stance on multilateralism, I think, will be a great retreat from multilateralism and a regional, and also retreat from regional power status, like what Lula has tried to build. And second is that I think the bilateral relationship between the US and Brazil is not breakable. It's still have some its internal problems, like US President Donald Trump was once said he wants to raise up the tariffs on iron and aluminum and steel from Brazil. But after like the negotiations, the Donald Trump, tried to, drop it, but you can see there's still not, some ways that it could be breakable, right? And the third way is that I think the future Bolsonaro's stance on foreign policy is that Brazil is still working on this whole constructive cooperation with the BRICS. It's not quitting, but it's still working with the BRICS. So it's, it's kind of a mixed. And on Chinese side, I think it's kind of a dual level style of Chinese multilateralism, because on the one hand, we have the system-wide confrontation with the US and adaptation to the role of an emerging power. And domestically, we have a surge of nationalism. And because this post-World War II multilateralism had been largely American-centric, so especially after 2013, we have seen this greater vigor and self-assertiveness in Chinese foreign policy. So China probably will tend to be more selective about deep engagement with multilateralism and try to make more practical calculations by issue area. For example, like what I said is that China is most likely to invest in building effective international cooperation and playing a leading role when its outside options are weak, meaning that China's interests will be undercut if it allows other powers to deal with the issue. So take the example of AIIB, right? The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, right? It means that if the AIIB offered Beijing a way to mitigate those problems, like the vulnerability to the risk, to those, you know, economic and political risk that we may confronted in the host countries, by enabling China to bind itself to a multilateral institution of China's making. So my conclusion is that I don't think there's a bipolar world will be seen in the future, because there's no China-controlled bloc, nor is it like to be formed. So the US bloc is growing weaker and transformed into something more heterogeneous, and more countries aren't willing to take sides or make the either or choice. So that's my conclusion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. In the sequence, I would to invite Professor Daniele Ramos, that's Professor of Chinese Foreign Policy at the University of Brasilia. She directs the graduate program on international relations and the Center of Global Studies. Daniele, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Célio Hiratuka, for introducing me, for inviting me for this very important meeting. Thank for the Chinese Consulate in São Paulo for this opportunity, and for my friends, Bruno de Conti, Professor Marcos Cordeiro Pires, for joining us to discuss multilateralism and China and Brazil's relation. Thank also for Chinese new friends for this opportunity to discuss this very important subject. So I start my presentation talking a little bit about Brazil-China relations, and then I will talk about multilateralism itself. So Brazil and China have been together for many, many decades. Since 1974, Brazil is China's most important economic and political partner in South America. There's no doubt about it. It is also a key player in the BRICS. Relations between Brazil and China have grown steadily since the diplomatic resumption in 1974, and both partners demonstrated the ability to overcome challenges and adversities that have arisen throughout common history. I think this is the moment Brazil and China should get together and also surmount some difficulties that has appeared in very recent history. In reality, no other bilateral relationship in Brazil has taken on such importance as quickly as Sino-Brazilian relations, both in global and comparative terms. From sparse and disorganized contacts, the two countries were able to organize complex relations in a very short time. During today's speech, as I said, I will explain how multilateral mechanisms can bring together partners like Brazil and China in combating the adverse effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is a fact that stronger structures and mechanisms for international cooperation are needed to mitigate the adverse effects of pandemic on people's lives and livelihoods around the world, particularly in fragile societies. Three mechanisms in particular are considered fundamental for better multilateral interactions, which I believe China is already in some way employing. The first mechanism is exercise of regional and global leadership. Nationalism, interstate competition, and political instability fractured the foundation of multilateral system, leaving many countries go at it alone, as Professor Sharon has said. When the pandemic hit, unfortunately, some nations prioritized the safety and security of those within their own borders. Travel bans were enforced, information sharing was neglected, export restrictions were implemented, and World Health Organization recommendations were ignored, including in Brazil. Despite the multilateral mechanisms in place to navigate global public health emergencies and address their economic, social, and political repercussions, heightened geopolitical tensions led many countries to adopt a unilateral approach. United Nations Secretary General called us to stop doing this kind of positions, and we should now start to look for new ways of working together in multilateral stance. So the second measure would be funding for global response efforts. While countries have allocated an almost unprecedented $8 trillion in domestic economic stimulus packages, financing for the global health emergency response has been slow and inadequate. 5 months into the Ebola outbreak in 2014, the Ebola response plan was 64% funded. With COVID-19, however, 4 months since it was declared a global public health emergency, the COVID-19 Global Humanitarian Response Plan was under 20% funded. To date, only 11% or $1.1 billion of the $99 billion COVID-19 health funded budget has been disbursed. So the third measure would be coordination in information sharing, public health messages, supply chain management, and humanitarian access. Deficiencies in communication and coordination have hindered effective crisis response in fragile contexts. Insufficient data in fragile contexts due to limited laboratory and testing capacity combined with inadequate data sharing practices have made it difficult to put together a truly global picture of the extent of the COVID-19 crisis. Despite its mandate to coordinate responses to global health emergencies, many countries have also diminished the credibility and effectiveness of World Health Organization by floating its guidance and recommendations. Examples of collaborations among scientists, however, show that models for better cooperation are possible. COVID-19 serves as a wake-up call to strengthen frameworks for cooperation and revive multilateralism, collective commitment to leave no one behind. The current pandemic has highlighted the urgency of multilateralism to meet the needs of the 21st century emergencies, calling for strengthening the three fundamental mechanisms. As I said, more solid leadership, more international funding, more coordination between governments and international society. In short terms, the leading global player as China and as regional player as Brazil should commit to COVID-19 vaccine development and distribution as a global public good, remove bureaucratic constraints to delivery on humanitarian action and services, leverage technology and new partnerships to distribute resources and supplies in a more transparent fashion. Incorporate vulnerable populations in national COVID-19 responses plans and national development plans. To improve long-term crisis preparedness and resilience, global leaders should also strengthen existing institutions to enhance their capacity to meet their global mandates, make existing institutions and platforms for cooperation more accountable and responsive by incorporating a broader array of stakeholders, provide more rapid, sustainable, and flexible financing to support vulnerable populations. I think Chinese response or diplomacy of masks, as we have heard since January, is a very good response, even though we need more Chinese and Brazilian response in the next months. So China made the following donations to Brazil and also to other Latin America countries. 29,600 test kits, 1,865,000 surgical masks, more than 200 ventilators, more than 31,000 protective clothings, more than 200,000 gloves, 110,000 masks N95, and more than 9,660,000 cash donation. So I think this is an ongoing bilateral cooperation that should be strengthened in the next months. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Daniela. Daniele, for your speech. Now, I would like to give the floor to Professor Chen Yifeng. He is a professor at Peking University Law School and assistant director of the Peking University Institute of International Law. Please, Professor Chen.
Thank you, Professor Hiratuka. And I also like to thank the organizer for offering this opportunity to exchange views with my Brazilian colleagues. Today, I would like to focus on a specific issue of international law, namely the global health law. The pandemic has caused many challenges to the international legal order. And today, I would like to specifically focus how this might affect the internal legal structure by looking at the specific branch of global health law. Please allow me to now do a screen sharing of this. Yes, yes, yes. Could you see me? Could you see this screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good.
We can see.
Okay, so today I would like to talk a bit about the rise of global health law and how this would affect the future legal order and how this will affect also the multilateralism. So first of all, I'd like to highlight that the COVID-19 is an international crisis, and it's a crisis in many regards. Of course, it's a public health crisis, but it's also a crisis beyond a public health dimension. And it has many dimensions related to economic, social, governmental, and international crisis. And we have seen how much difficulty the crisis has caused at the governance level, both national and international, and also transnational. And one biggest problem for our response to the global pandemic is that we have been now eradicating so many wars between the governments, wars between the states, and even wars for those small communities. So I think it might be necessary for fighting the pandemic, but it's also very important for us to transcend those borders. And currently, I think we see a lot of lack of interregulations in terms of international law. And we also see the limits of those international organizations. One, international law and international legal order is always characterized by crisis. Both the League of Nations and the United Nations were built upon the perish of 2 world wars. But this war against the virus does not lead us to renewed faith in international organizations. And we have seen now increasingly vocal dissatisfaction and disagreement with international organizations. So we see a sense that some governments, some countries that tend to displace international cooperation. And nationalism, populism has been a very powerful instrument, both in fighting the COVID-19, but also in securing political support for certain political parties. So it becomes a very important and difficult dimension for the current international legal order. And increasingly, I think among international legal scholars, we see a need for a holistic approach to pandemic response. So we need to address those issues, both from public health perspective, but from also by including other important dimensions. And I think I would like to highlight the continued relevance of the World Health Organization and its international health regulations. And we have heard the voice from certain countries that they are now withdrawing their contribution to the WHO, and there's also some disagreement and unhappiness voiced by some countries against WHO in different contexts. But I would like to highlight this evening that the founding of the WHO was attributed to the contribution of Brazil and China. So when Brazil and China and other countries at San Francisco in 1945 to deliberate the establishment of the United Nations, then Brazil and China jointly submitted a governmental proposal to the committee, saying that we need to establish an international health organization and subject it to the Economic Social Council. And this proposal was unanimously supported by all the countries. And eventually in the next year, in 1946, the the WHO constitution was deliberated and approved. And then the constitution eventually came into force in 1948. So that came the World Health Organization. So I would say that it is a joint project that was initiated by Brazil and China. Then we made jointly the World Health Organization. And we also have, in some sense, a special responsibility in uphold the World Health Organization for future world order. The international health regulations is one probably most important legal architecture for the current international health regulation. And this is a regulation, the latest one was adopted by the World Health Assembly in 2005. And this regulation has made a bigger improvement compared to its early version drafted in 1969. And in this new version, the international health regulation empowered the director of the WHO to announce unilaterally the existence of public health emergency of internal concern, and by which all the countries might impose certain more regulatory measures to combat the global pandemic. But this approach is largely an approach of cooperation, supported by science and guided by experts. It's not an approach for confrontation by politicization. And it is also crafted with a careful balance between the need for the respect sovereignty of the countries, and also to address the need of the other country to take public health response measures, and also to highlight the protection of the human rights of those international travelers. But this, of course, shows its limited. It shows its limits in this COVID-19. For example, we now see that when the COVID-19 is so contagious, we might need to take more forcible measures against the containment of this virus, and we might do a lot more to do many measures that will be very intrusive in terms of human rights protection. And we also might need to do more intervention in terms of transportation and traffics. And we also now see the marginalization of the World Health Organization in this pandemic response, which is largely led by all those individual governments rather than by the WHO. So for the future of global health law, we also need to not only to strengthen WHO and its health regulation, but we also need to incorporate other aspects of international law. For example, now we see when the pandemic comes, some countries enacted regulation to restrict the export of personal protective equipment. This might be in violation of WHO rules, but also could cause the disruption to global supply chains, and which could cause further problem to the fight against the pandemic. And then also now some national regulation on the food import, on internet traffic, and others. And again, the human rights is also coming to the forefront. We would like to attain the highest standard for health. The right to health is at stake, of course. But when we look at the national measures taken by states to fight against COVID-19, this also again raises the concern about human rights protection in terms of privacy, in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and all these issues. So human rights law would again at the forefront when we fight against pandemic. And then also the intellectual property protection issue, especially when it comes to vaccine development and vaccine sharing. So we need to protect both the intellectual property rights of big companies, but then we also need to make a proper balance to ensure the access of vaccines by all the people in need. And there are also other emerging issues which would concern investment, environment protection, biosafety, and etc. So all these should be a very important aspect when we want to develop a holistic approach to global health law. So I think it would be very imminent for us to build a new block of international legal order for us to fight against this global pandemic. And I would now like to highlight some some role that developing countries could play. And I would say that while the COVID-19 has posed a challenge for all the countries alike, but the developing countries are definitely suffering a lot more compared to some others. For example, the developing countries would have a large amount of economy running in the form of informal sectors, and many people would not receive social protection. And when the social distancing and other quarantine measures put in place, people's livelihood is actually at stake, and it's difficult for them actually to practice quarantine and social distancing measures, and they often lack the protective equipments. And some of people might be able to do teleworking at home, and according to International Labour Organization statistics, there are only about 18% of the whole working population who are able to use teleworking possibilities. And the great majority would not be able to practice this way of work. And we also see the increasing social inequality arising from this pandemic. So I think the developing countries are facing specific challenges in this specific time. So it's important to develop capacity building, both in terms of medical capacity, but also in capacity of other dimensions. And it's also very important to look at the access of the vaccine by developing countries. I think it's very important for China and other countries to ensure that they are able to distribute the vaccine in an equitable and a fair way, and in an affordable price. And we also need to look at how the countries, many developed countries, also inhabit level of state debt. So it's important for them to have developmental finance access. And also I would like to highlight the South-to-South cooperation is also essential for the future development of the global health law and in tackling the pandemics of this scale. So I would like to thank again the organizer for this opportunity, and thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chen. And now I would like to invite my colleague, Professor Bruno de Conti, that is professor at the Institute of Economics at Unicamp, but also the Brazilian director of Confucius Institute. Bruno, please.
Thank you, Célio. Good morning to all of you who are in Brazil. Good evening for those who are in China. I apologize because my internet connection these days is really, really unstable. So if I have some problem, I can try to reconnect through my cell phone, but I hope it won't happen. I'd like to thank São Paulo Consulate, Chinese Consulate, for contacting us and proposing this webinar. We already had good contact with the consulate for cultural activities related to the Confucius Institute, but this is the first time we organize a research activity together, and this is really, really nice. A special thanks to the General Consul Chen Peijie. Being the last what I was saying, being the last to speak, I'll some recommendations, but obviously, in order to make those recommendations, I have to tell you a little bit about my understanding. Of multilateralism. So I hear some ideas from Professor Shen, but obviously in adaptation for these discussions. In my opinion, the important
I think that Professor Bruno connection is broken.
Yes,
Bruno?
sorry, it came. Can you hear me?
The connection is a little
It's
bit.
really bad, right?
Yeah, yeah. Maybe you can send me the presentation.
Or I can just leave. I don't use the presentation. I can just mention it. Okay.
Okay.
So
maybe it's better you connect by
things
phone,
that
maybe. I don't know, but I can hear you, Bruno. It's the connection is very bad. Maybe could be better if you could connect by the phone. It's possible.
Yes, I'm doing it.
Okay. Sorry. With this situation, we always have this kind of technical problems.
And it's funny that Célio, that sometimes it's easier to communicate with China than Brazil.
So can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, Bruno.
And can you see me?
Yeah, it's better.
Can you see me as well or not?
No.
Okay, but no problem.
I think that you need to turn on the camera. Yes.
I never used it in my cell phone, but it's not a problem. I can go to my presentation, which is the most important thing. Now you see me?
No.
Well,
I still can see you. But,
well, no problem.
Let me see. No. Yeah.
No
but
problem.
Okay, we can go on just with the voice.
Sorry about that. But what I was telling you is that I have some guiding questions. And the first one is, what's the nature of the crisis? Second one, what is being reviewed by the crisis? Then we move into the global responses to the crisis, and why do we have these global responses? Then finally, I go into what should be done in terms of global governance for the short and the long term, and then which role for China and Brazil, moving for my final remarks. So the historical context of the crisis, we cannot see this crisis as a very only seeing what is happening in 2020, in my opinion. Paulo Nogueira Batista Jr., which is a very important Brazilian economist, but also other authors are trying to make this analysis, seeing this crisis as a multidimensional crisis. And we have to understand the corona crisis by looking also to the global financial crisis and its economic consequences, and then it moved into a political crisis, because with the economic and social crisis, we have populism and anti-multilateralism rising in many countries. So we see, for instance, the election of Donald Trump and also the election of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and some other parts of the world, Viktor Orbán and so on. So the economic and social crisis became a political crisis with populists and far-right presidents in many, or prime ministers in many parts of the world. And then here we come with the corona crisis, with these kind of leaders in the world, which are in principle against multilateralism. Then moving into the dimensions of the crisis, we see that it is a sanitary crisis, it is an economic crisis, as you know, it is a political crisis, but it has two very important dimensions that I want to highlight. It is an ecological crisis and it is a social crisis, as I mentioned. And these last two dimensions of the crisis, being an ecological crisis and a social crisis, engenders, in my opinion, and I'm not alone in seeing it, a humanitarian crisis. It's a very serious crisis we are living now, notably due to these two dimensions, the ecological one and the social one. Just to give you some numbers, you all know, but we have in this moment more than 1 million deaths caused by COVID-19, but we also have these social impacts mostly over the peripheral countries, but not only. So according to some estimations by the International Labour Organization, something like 10% of the full-time jobs in the world are at risk. 1.6 billion workers in the informal economy are at risk of losing their livelihoods. So it's something like 50% of the global workforce. And 265 million people are expected to face acute food insecurity. It's a 100% augmentation according due to the corona crisis, according to the World Food Programme analysis. And what are the global responses? My colleagues have already mentioned that. So even in, we had some countries' response that were very positive, including the Chinese responses. We have some multilateral institutions also with positive responses like UNCTAD. But overall, what we had is that we had no global governance. Even in the most consolidated regional union, which is the European Union, we had some fissures. We had problems, for instance, with the immigrants in the whole world, especially in Latin America, where immigrants, they lost their jobs in their countries they were living in, and then they were just prevented to going back to their countries because of the borders that were closed in a non-harmonized way, I mean, with no dialogues between the neighbor countries. We have even, we had even accusations of modern piracy, as you know, regarding masks, the import of masks. And many leaders, as my colleagues said, with very disrespectful attitude regarding the World Health Organization. And why did it happen? In my opinion, the current global governance is still not global. We name it as global governance, but it is still not global. It's rather a Western developed countries' governance over the globe. And then here I come to what should be done in terms of the global governance, and I'd like to divide my proposals into the short term and the long term. For the short term, we have some urgent things that have to be done, both in terms of the sanitary crisis and the economic crisis. So in terms of the sanitary crisis, my colleagues also said, it's absolutely necessary to have cooperation for the distribution of equipment, tests, and vaccines to the whole globe. We have to have cooperation for all researches related to coronavirus, and here the universities are very important in this role. And for the economic dimension, UNCTAD, a report by UNCTAD this year, has some very interesting proposals. For instance, temporary standstills on debt service payments, since many peripheral countries are having problems in paying their external debts. So debt relief programs are very important. Capital controls, it is indeed important perennially, but mostly in moments of stress of the financial markets. These economic crises the peripheral countries are living may last more than necessary due to the volatility of the capital flows. With impacts over the exchange rates, for instance, we have very high depreciation of many Latin American currencies, for instance. International assistance, and the UNCTAD proposes a Marshall Plan for health recovery, which is also an interesting proposal. Anyway, we have to have massive investments worldwide to revamp the economy, and China obviously can play a really important role on that. And then coming to the long term, which is the most important discussion. There are two, we can discuss more specific proposals in terms of, or an agenda, a specific agenda for multilateralism, but due to the current situation, which is very uncertain, and this uncertainty is not only, but also caused by a major event that will happen in a bit more than 1 week, which is the election in the United States of America. If Donald Trump is re-elected, obviously this anti-multilateralism gets stronger. And Jair Bolsonaro and his anti-multilateralism also gets stronger. If he loses Donald Trump, then in my opinion, we have the possibility of rehabilitating the multilateralism. But still, in order to discuss this, the details of what might be an agenda for multilateralism, I guess we have to go into the structure of it, seeing that there are two very important axes that may be guides for us to the constitution of a real global governance. And the first one relates to inequalities. Inequalities within countries and inequalities between countries. Most of my colleagues and the General Consul have already mentioned it, that it's really important to cope with inequalities both in national and international terms. Without this struggle against inequality, we won't have a global governance. We won't have multilateralism with so deep differences and heterogeneities in the standard of life between countries. And the second very important axe, in my opinion, for the constitution of a real global governance is ecology. The ecological problems are by definition supranational. It's impossible to cope with the ecological problems, with the climate change and so on, in national terms. It has to be, by definition, a supranational struggle. So it may be one of the, and it should be, in my opinion, one of the most important flags for this reconstitution of multilateralism. So inequalities and ecology. And what role for China and Brazil? The constitution of a real global governance won't be made by Western developed countries, in my opinion. The pandemic makes it clear and reveals the empty spaces regarding the global governance. So China and Brazil and BRICS together have a very important role to keep struggling for a new order, not only when we talk about BRICS, not only for the 5 member countries, but for all global South countries. Obviously, the current government and my Brazilian colleagues and also the Chinese colleagues have already said it. The current Brazilian government is not engaged in this effort, is not anymore contributing to this effort, but for the long term, we hope that we will have governments in Brazil that will again see the necessity of reconstructing the new international order. Maintaining the discussion about the role for Brazil and China, I'd like to stick that the most important thing, in my opinion, is having serious struggles to reduce inequalities and for the ecological transitions. I would say those are the two most important axes for the reconstitution of global governance, multilateralism, and Brazil and China may play a very important role. China is already playing in both dimensions, but Brazil currently, unfortunately, not. It can be done, obviously, by national governments with national initiatives, BRICS institutions, collective action of both governments in global forums, as soon as we have a government in Brazil that is more concerned about these topics. But it has to be done also with actions that go beyond national government. Some of my colleagues have also mentioned that we have to see, we have already some very positive actions by subnational governments here in Brazil, even if the national government is not engaged in these multilateralism, but we do have some subnational government initiatives that are very important to face the pandemics. And academia, obviously, universities and the civil society as a whole. So a real global government has to be associated with less inequalities and ecological sustainability. And at the end, and this is my final idea, it has to be done with a new economic model. Capitalism, as we know it, is not enough to cope with these two important, very important, crucial problems, inequalities and ecological sustainability. So we, again, China can step behind and lead us for the front in the constitution of a new economic model. Either we face these two problems together, or we perish together. This is my opinion. Thank you very much. And sorry again for the problems with the connection.
Okay, thank you, Bruno. And thank you for all of you for respecting the time. Now we have almost half an hour to have a discussion. I would like to start with some questions to all professors. The first one is specifically, some of you have, and also Bruno, have just talked about the South cooperation. And then I'd like to ask you if really could South-South cooperation be a lever for multilateral order, more conducive to solving a set of economic and social problems, especially for the developing countries? If yes, what do you think that could be the mechanism that could strengthen this kind of South-South cooperation? This is a question that I would like to hear some words of all of you. The second one, especially for my Brazilian colleagues, it's a question about, you know that we are passing by a very specific political situation, but what is the balance in relation with China between the economic interests, mainly between Brazilian agribusiness, but also those sectors that have expectation of Chinese investments in infrastructure, for example, and the most radical position of a more ideological wing of the government. And finally, a specific question to Professor Chen Yifeng that it's related to the intellectual property laws, international property laws. How is it possible to ensure the balance between, at the same time, protection innovators, the big pharmaceutical companies, for example, but also how could it be possible to guarantee the access of the global population to essential medicines like vaccines, for example? I think that we could start with the first round of comments by our professors. Maybe we could follow the same order. Unfortunately, Professor Chen Yi have to leave the conference. But then we could start with Professor Marcos Cordeiro.
Friends, I think not only the question made by Brazilian, but I'm so sorry. Let me put the microphone. I'm sorry. The question made by Professor Célio to all Brazilians about the difficulties to us to think, for example, South-South cooperation. It's a big problem because Brazil gave up its status like a developing country. The government, this government searched to be a member of OCDE. Then I think the approach like a developing country in this government is so difficult. I don't know how the Brazilian society and the businessmen will pressing this government to take another approach in international relations, mainly with China. Why? China nowadays is our major commercial partner. major trade partner. For the goods that we export to China, most part of them, we have some competition with the United States. I don't know how, for example, people from the agriculture sector will lead, for example, when the government, Bolsonaro government, will do some offense or offensive attitude against China, how this government a lot of time have did. I don't know. It's difficult to us to think about this because in this government, with the close cooperation with United States, with the pressure made by United States, including with the support of militaries in Brazil, I think that is almost impossible to change the road made by this government. I don't know how we can fix our relationship with China after the Bolsonaro government. But for me, I'm very pessimist in this situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcos. I think that we can follow the order of the speech. Professor Sharon, could you make some comments, please?
Yeah, I agree most of what Professor Marco said. I just feel like number one is that I don't think let's say that I have a doubt on whether Bolsonaro will have another term, 4-year term after 2022. So if he doesn't have another term, the relations between China and Brazil could be a completely, I think, completely a overturn. So that's one. And second is that it's not about whether China, how Brazil will fix the relationship with China. It's just not the Brazilian government does not want to, definitely not want to get out China from its domestic economy, and it's really hard for them to try to kick China out. But the thing is that how would them to alleviate or to aggregate the relation or deepen the relationship with China, because China really starting last year had lessened its trade surplus with Brazil. So the question is, how would Brazil deepen its relationship with China? And on the third section is that how would Brazil, either Bolsonaro or post-Bolsonaro president, we don't know who, would try its hardest to mitigate influence and the destruction of the United States in Brazilian's domestic politics. So I think these are the 3 points I want to make. Yeah.
Thank you. Daniele, could you please?
Thank you for the question, Professor Célio. We can analyze this question about South-South cooperation and Brazil-China relations, taking into consideration multilateral relations and bilateral relations. And both level of analysis could be analyzed by a historical perspective and a more contemporary perspective. In the more historical perspective, we can say that Brazil and China have been working together for more than 40 years. We have very solid relationship. We have almost traditional relations as United States and Europe relations. So we can consider this actual context as an exceptional context in Brazil-China relations. So I think, like Professor Sharon, that in 2 years we will have very different China-Brazil relationships. So we should keep going, hoping for a better moment to develop this relationship. So I think that in the more contemporary analysis, we can see some recent context or data that are putting some difficulties in this relationship, since we are very influenced by Brazil-United States relationship. So we have this triangular relationship that has to wait for American elections. So maybe we have new context and maybe new development in Brazil-China relationship. In a more multilateral perspective, we should maybe invest in BRICS relationship and have more support from Russia, India, South America to develop infrastructure investments in Brazil coming from these 5 countries. And in this context, I think that Brazil also is a very plural, multi-level society, and China's actors have already understood this. So I think that China's government and China's enterprises are working with different actors in Brazil. Not only Brazilian president has power in Brazil, but also enterprises, governors, mayors are in direct contact with China's actors and making many efforts to develop this relationship in order to surmount COVID-19 effects. We have, for example, this new information in the newspaper that also Oxford vaccine has Chinese components. So Brazil's president has a problem to solve here, since every vaccine is the result of multilateral cooperation. So we have to focus on COVID effects and not on political problems. And we have to focus on social needs and not only political needs. In this sense, I think that China and Brazil relations are very strong. Brazilian society is very aware of this positive effect that China relation with Brazil could bring to this country. And we think that this is the moment to answer to United Nations Secretary call for more integration, more cooperation, and quick response to COVID-19 effects, so we can live again maybe in a more normal situation of more cooperation, more investment, or more trade as we had in the next 40 years, in the last 40 years in Brazil-China relationship. So I think that South-South cooperation should focus on different actors from different levels in Brazil and China's relationship, and Brazil-China relationship should keep going, waiting for the opportunities that will appear. I'm sure, as Professor Sharon said, we have a very specific result in Brazil-China relation in agricultural area. We have a surplus in much more interesting and very good relations in agricultural level. We also had very good result rate. And so this is a very diverse relationship. We should just keep going. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Danielle. Professor Chen, could you make some comments?
Okay. Yes, thank you for your question. I'd like to very briefly reflect on the issue about intellectual property protection and its role in this fight against global pandemic. Of course, intellectual property rights protection is a very important legal regime or legal block in international legal order, and it is sometimes considered very essential for the companies, for the pharmaceutical companies develop new drugs and vaccines. But I think when it comes to this COVID-19, actually it is possible. I think at least two possible ways we could deal with this issue. For example, one thing that we could use, for example, the exception, the medical exception when it comes to the to the intellectual property rights when there's imminent need that we could use this exception. But this is very rarely used. The other one is actually the segregation of markets, often counted by the pharmaceutical company, that they would allow the selling of certain drugs to certain countries at a very low price, on the condition that those drugs would not go back to other markets, because these markets would be given preferential price, and this should not distort the operation or transaction in other markets. But in this COVID-19, I think we are very lucky. We are very lucky to have the actual WHO to lead a vaccine program, and it is already planned. Many countries have signed on board, and including China. And I think countries that would do joint effort to have an equitable and fair distribution of those vaccines. So this would allow a fair and equitable access. I think it's very important. I think there are three challenges to this global access to the vaccine. One is that to have the monopoly or possession of these vaccines. We have seen in the early stage that, for example, the United States tried to acquire certain German developer company in order to make sure that it would have priority in purchasing those vaccines. The other issue is really about the expense. And now we have seen more and more voluntary financing has been channeled to the WHO program. And I think it's very important for the least developed countries. Not all the countries would be able to afford the expense of vaccine, and when it comes to the scale of vaccine we would need. So this is the second issue. The third issue is really, I think when we come to is how we also need to reflect more profoundly about the intellectual property rights issue in handling those very seriously contagious virus. Should we try, or should we now would be more flexible in intellectual property protection in order to allow country to develop a very fast response to certain situation? So I think all these would present not only as individualistic issue, but also more systemic questions about how we do intellectual property rights protection in the future. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chen. And now finally, I'd like to turn to Bruno, the Conti, for his comments.
Thank you, Célio, for your questions. And yes, in my opinion, this South-South dialogue is the only possible way of changing things in the world arena. History shows that the Southern countries cannot just wait for changes as a gift given by the developed countries. And that's why I stressed in my presentation the importance of this alliance between the Southern countries, which is not easy, obviously, and it takes time as well. We are now seeing in Brazil and in some other parts of the world a move back in this process, as my colleagues already mentioned. So looking to the current situation, Marco said he's very pessimist, and I'm also very pessimist. I don't think, even if we try to make our struggles, I don't think we can change things in this sense with this current government. But it will finish eventually. And I really trust that a new government will be concerned again in constructing good relations, not only with the developed countries, which is also important, obviously, US, European Union, and so on, but again, with Latin America, with Africa, with Asian countries, and within BRICS. And I see BRICS as a very important group in this struggle. And when we see the last years, we already see moves that have, geopolitical moves that have to be done by the Western developed countries in response to BRICS. So it is a strong bloc. And obviously, China has a very important role in all this process, because it has now very important economic relations with many or most of the Southern countries in the world. And it can be, and it is being a very important country in order to establish this dialogue. always trying to keep these dialogues as horizontal dialogues. So this is my opinion. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Bruno. We still have some minutes to a final round of questions. I'd like to put here some questions that was posted in the chat. The first one is from Felipe Alves Peixoto, and I think that it's especially for our colleagues from China. The question is, there is a possibility of a different trade standard between Brazil and China, with China raising the imports of Brazilian industrial or semi-industrial products. Would China be willing to absorb these products in a way to balance the trade between our countries? Maybe Professor Sharon could give some comments about that. And the second one is about the perspective, if it's from Talita Pinotti, that asks if it's possible to see a Chinese-Brazilian partnership to reinforce the partnership, especially she's asking about the role that Brazil can play in the Brazilian, the Asian Infrastructure Bank. If the ratification of the Brazilian membership in the bank can foster the relationship between Brazil and China. Maybe Professor Chen could make some comments about that.
I'm sorry, Célio. Can you repeat the first question? I didn't get it.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
If it's a question about the trade relation between Brazil and China, if it's possible to see some kind of standard where China could raise the imports of Brazilian industrial or semi-industrial products, and not only commodity products. If it's possible to have some perspective of have a more kind of more balanced between the goods that are Brazilian export and imports from China.
Yes, I think this question reflects a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, we're definitely willing to export more diversified products from Brazil, because we are trying to cooperate in many other aspects besides commodities, like those biofuel, the electricity cars, right? Those kind of sectors, we are trying to build more cooperations. But on the other hand, is that how much? But it's very honest, like, to be honest. But what do you like from our side? We would think like how much percentage could Brazilian sectors besides commodities could offer to China? Because we already have a very stable sources from other sectors, from other regions. And so if Brazil want to have more percentage on sectors that other than commodities, I think Brazil have to have its like more value-added products, rather than, you know, keep blaming on why China has not why China has an unequal balance, trade balance with Brazil. I think this is a question that we have talked a lot between both countries. So I think this is a double-edged sword, for my own opinion. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Professor Chen, could you?
Yeah, thank you for the question,
okay.
Professor Hiratuka. I think when it comes to Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, I checked. I think Brazil is actually a prospective founding member. So when the AIIB was initially negotiated, I think Brazil was involved and was prepared to have it as a founding member. but I think the Brazil has not ratified the convention yet. And the statute of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank has made a distinction between regional members and non-regional members. Regional members refer to those members in Asian region, and those non-regional members refer to those states come from outside Asia. And I think Brazil definitely could be part of this big project. The AIIB is the basic aim of the AIIB is to invest in infrastructure projects in Asia countries. And it could also, in some exceptional case, to fund those projects outside the Asian member countries, but would be conducive towards Asia economic development or Asia connectivity. So I think we would really be happy to have Brazil on board and to contribute to both to the governance structure of the AIIB and also to improve the operational policies and standards with the involvement of Brazil and other developing countries. I think it's very important. Yeah. Here's my brief observation.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chen. We are approaching the limit of our time. I would like to ask you or to question if any of you would like to make any more comments or would like to make some statement before I think that before we pass to the Council of China to make the final statement. Any of the professor would like to make some comments or add something? Okay, then we can make this final round, and then Professor Marcos, Professor Tom, and then we could pass to the Council to make the final statement. Okay?
Okay.
Marcos.
I think that the current situation of the bilateral relations between China and Brazil is not so good, despite the huge mountain of goods that Brazil exported to China. But I believe that China needs to have a strategic patience in the face of Brazil's current problems under the Bolsonaro government. Because the relationship is a long-term construction, not only 2 or 1 terms of the Brazil Jair Bolsonaro government, because there are a lot of people, how said Professor Daniela, that look at China as a good partner, searching for investment, searching for technology. Then, despite nowadays offenses made by the Brazilian government, China have to think our relationship in a long term, not only in short term in this government. Thank you one more time for inviting me and to participate of this meeting.
Okay, thank you, Marcos. Professor Tom, you would like to make some comments?
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting morning. And thank you, Chen Peijie, for having us organize this. This has been very informative. My area is not international relations, so I've been learning a lot, and I've never seen such a complex international relations discussion because it's on a specific area that is not talked about so much, and we have a lot of new elements to digest. But one thing I think as we are moving out of the, eventually out of the crisis caused by COVID, which is at multi-levels, as many of you have put in, is that we must understand how the economy is being reconstructed in various parts of the world, so as we can learn how to reconstruct our economy. And I think here, some of the policy work that I've seen come out of China could be very instructive. For example, the street sellers and people like that who have been essentially taken off the streets of Shanghai and Beijing are now coming back on. So this kind of work where you just reintroduce a policy option and make the markets more flexible, it seems to me that we can probably learn off this. And probably some other things, not that we imitate, but just to learn what has been done in terms of economic reconstruction. Much easier in China, of course, where you have growth than in Brazil, where we have negative growth. I certainly feel that Brazil is going to have many domestic problems to confront as we go through. And I would certainly like to see some further debates and questions about policy options in China and a reflection on that, because this is the way we build trust, we build understanding of each other. And if this particular period of time the country is going through is, we're all very uncomfortable with it, it will not last forever, as has been said before. China and Brazil have a natural path forwards. And I would very much like to say how the BRICS framework, with its idea of sovereignty, the idea of equality between partners and win-win, has been a very interesting framework just to get people talking and exploring common points of view together and moving ahead. So Professor Chen has talked about this in the area of health, and I think we can do probably quite a lot within this particular framework, just of talking as equals, talking as sovereign, and talking as people who can win on both sides. That's all I want to say, but thank you very much for you all. I learned a lot.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Now I'd like to invite the Consul Chen Peijie to say the final words, the closing words of this webinar.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. I carefully listened to all the contributions. I think every professor shared with us his or her views, very special, unique observation on the relevant issue. And the views are interesting and also very valuable. So I learned a lot. Regarding the bilateral relations and cooperation between China and Brazil, well, although our topic today is the multilateralism, but more focusing, I can feel the more interest on that. So regarding the bilateral one, I'm confident to the our two sides, the relations, and I also hope that all professors and other friends and people also can be confident on that. I can feel the some little hesitation or doubts or worry on that, but I fully agree with what Professor Daniela said about the how to look at such issue. And well, the very good cooperation in history, okay, are there. I won't mention more. And last October, President Bolsonaro visited China and met with President Xi Jinping. They not only exchanged views on a lot of issues and also signed a joint declaration to reiterate the strengthening the cooperation, solidarity, and the bilateral relations. So that's the written paper there. And this year, during the pandemic, the two presidents, they communicated by telephone, and again reiterate to facing to responding such a big challenge of the people. So with the what we'll do with the cooperation, the solid solidarity, and to jointly overcome such difficulties. So that's the big background. And in the factual situation is that the cooperation between two countries are very fruitful, and the cooperation is in wide range. Not only the investment in infrastructure and the new high-tech fields, and the well, even for people-to-people exchange. So that's also kind of a cooperation like today's exchange views here. So all different two sides profess to sit together. So that's So all the corporations are very fruitful, and all the cooperative programs are carrying out very well. And so I think based on the principle of, like the old professor said that again, that under the principle of cooperation and mutual respect, mutual benefit, and win-win result. So all possibilities could be explored, could be developed. So, I think, well, I just want to share my confidence to the our future relations to all of you. And regarding South-South cooperation, I think the old professors also had a very good opinion on that. In my eye, both China and Brazil are developing countries, and the two biggest in East half and the West half. And in past, we have a lot of very good cooperative results, like our cooperation in the satellite field, in all the other fields. And so we always feel very proud of that, to say that our two cooperation are the very good model to South-South cooperation. And that's the history, no one can change. So in future, based on this, all the developing countries, we have our own needs. And the cooperation, the help in between are very important. So South-South cooperation is still a very important, big topic, and both China and Brazil really can do a lot for that. Okay, no more others. So I know time is up now. Well, I just want to extend my warm, sincere thanks and congratulations to all professors, that all your views are really valuable. So I thank you very much. And I do hope that, I think today's seminar is successful. And I do hope that we can continue such a dialogue, and to help the two countries to enhance our very friendly relations, and to develop the further cooperation and further friendship. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Chen Peijie. With final words, I think that I would like also to thank for the support of Consulate of China, and also for the participation of all of the professors, especially that are in China, late at night already. And then I expect that we could repeat this kind of event in the future. Thank you. And also thank you for the assistants that are follow in the YouTube this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, all the colleagues. Nice meeting you all.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.